Buenos días, bon dia, good morning. Gracias a todos por estar aquí. Thank you so much for being with us. We want to kick off the week in this program, the Hispanic Response and Recovery Plan, bringing us all together for a coordination and mobilization effort to make sure that we mitigate the impact of COVID-19 in our Hispanic community here in the States. My name is Claudia Romo Edelman, and we're delighted to be able to kick off the week with a very special guest. Her name is Carmen Burbano de Lara, and she's the director of School Feeding Division of the World Food Program. This conversation aims actually to bring to light what is the World Food Program perspective about what's happening with COVID-19. We've heard a number of times that we not only have a health crisis, but we're really getting into a food crisis where, like our farmers have been affected, agriculture has been affected, schools being closed, and children being, like in food dependency are affected. And it's a pleasure to actually welcome Carmen Burbano de Lara. Thank you so much for being with us and giving us your perspective.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So I would like to start with, what is WFP's response to the pandemic? What are the main concerns? What is the situation? We know that you, as the name of your organization indicates, you are a world organization, and we would love to understand a little bit about what's the scene? How does it look like?
So maybe let me start by giving you and the audience a little bit of a perspective of what the UN World Food Program is. This is an organization that was set up and that continues to play a very important role internationally in making sure that children and people have the food that they need to thrive and to live full and productive lives. We are the largest organization of the United Nations system, and we are present in more than 100 countries with food assistance programs. This can go from life-saving programs. In many countries, the people that we support really depend on the food that we provide them, all the way towards life-changing programs like school feeding programs that I manage. And those are programs that really aspire to providing people better lives, supporting them to achieve their potential. When it comes to school feeding, for example, we provide the meals that children need in school so that they can concentrate on the lessons, they can concentrate on learning, and they can graduate and have a better life. So our span of work reaches almost 100 million people every year. It's a large organization with expertise on the humanitarian side, moving and buying food, distributing food, logistics, procurement, getting things to where they're supposed to be. We are the logistics leader of the United Nations, so we support not just what is needed from our own programs, but also the entire humanitarian community through an aviation service, a logistics service, to make sure that things get to where they need to go in crises. And we also support governments with their own programs when their capacity is limited, in many cases with nutrition programs, school feeding programs, etc. And so when this year started, the World Food Program was already concerned. We had already signaled an alarm because in 2019, we found that there were 135 million people around the world that were acutely hungry before COVID even started. This is people that really have problems finding money to put food on the table, and this was 135 million people in 2019. That's where we started the year from, very preoccupying. And now what our analysis is telling us is that because of COVID, and not just because of the virus itself, but mainly because of the effects of the economic downturn, another 130 million people will go into severe hunger. So in 2020, we're looking at about 265 million people around the world that will go into severe hunger if we don't do anything about it. And if we look at those totals, of course, it's very alarming, but 30 million of those people really depend on the World Food Program to survive. These are people that are either in refugee camps or they are IDPs, they're displaced populations, what we call, or there are people that are really struggling to come out of very complicated situations like conflict, displacement, and other things. So these 30 million people, if they don't get support from the World Food Program, they very simply are going to go really hungry and possibly die. So the consequences of really mobilizing in the United States, in various countries across the world to make sure that, first of all, we are tackling hunger problems across the board, but also supporting the World Food Program and the work that we do to ensure that these people get the support that they need are now more important than ever.
Carmen, I am so proud that you're a Hispanic star, like rocking it and moving it in WFP. I've been in the United Nations system forever, and I actually didn't realize you were the largest agency out there. I would have said UNICEF since I worked there before, but so proud of having an Ecuadorian Hispanic star working in international fields, doing a global impact. Carmen, do me a favor, like, for a lot of people, it is very hard to understand why COVID has had an impact on, on the food and food scarcity and food crisis. Just like go back and say, you started by saying, there was a problem to start with because there was malnutrition and hunger and so on. But let us know why. What happens? Is it because farmers are getting sick? Is it because there's less stores? Is it because what's causing the crisis? How has COVID exacerbated the problem?
So if we go back, you mentioned before COVID, and there were a lot already, an enormous amount of people that were going hungry. Our analysis tells us that it's not because there was lack of food. It's not because there is no food that's being produced in the world. There is food being produced in the world.
Actually, a lot of food waste, yeah?
Yeah, enough food to feed all of us, actually. The disparities and the inequalities between people that have too much to eat and people that don't have enough to eat is really a question of access. What we're talking about, first of all, is families that are very, very limited in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their income to be able to purchase food. So that's one issue. We also have in many countries families that are situated in areas that really have very limited markets. And so we're also talking about supply chains and markets not functioning very well and not really providing that access to people that they need. And then we're also realizing in 2019, our organization really signaled the alarm that the major cause of hunger is actually conflict. And what we mean by that is the more that conflict exists in many parts of the world, we're talking about Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and different intractable conflict situations, it generates human suffering to an extent to which it generates hunger. We're talking about people that have been displaced, people that have been forced to flee their own countries, and within those countries, supply chains get interrupted, government programs get interrupted, and people go into these dire circumstances. So those are some of the reasons why we had been seeing before COVID that there is a continuous amount of people that go hungry, and most of it is because of conflict. Now, if you add COVID to that mix, then the issue of access becomes exacerbated. Why? Because in many of the countries that are currently on lockdown, we have people that are not able to work, not able to do what they used to do to put food on the table. And so their income is starting to go down and down and down, and then they really don't have the resources to put food on the table for children and for their families. So that's the first problem. Then, of course, we have the economic downturn that countries themselves are feeling, and the shrinking national programs that used to be supporting these families, food stamps programs, voucher programs, cash transfer programs, that are slowly drying up, slowly shrinking. And so we have the people that are at the bottom of the pyramid, the ones that really rely on government support, they are getting less and less support from those government programs because of the economic downturn. And the third thing also is we are seeing disruptions in the supply chain. So as you know, we live in a globalized world. Food gets produced in one side of the planet, but then gets transported to another side of the planet. Not every country produces everything they need. So they import, they export. We're talking about very, very globalized markets. In an era where countries are limiting and putting barriers to that movement of food and the trade and the free trade of food is where we start to get really crunches in terms of the ability of people to being able to buy the food that they need.
Yeah, and it's quite dramatic in a way what you just mentioned. We have in even like in the states where we operate, we had a number of we have number of hubs, little communities of groups of action, and they are choosing food as the main priority in some instances because they don't actually, because they are like they don't have they are not registered, they are not legal, and so they are not getting either the stamps or they are not getting any support from anyone. So for example, in the south of Texas, the Hispanic Star Hub had to distribute, like their local priority was food, and we went around and distributed more than 6,000 despensas, no, so baskets of food with primary food for people that don't get that benefit, that doesn't get actually at the end of the day. I do want to go into the schooling and your programs in WFP, but Carmen, what would you suggest for, like organizations like ours that have, like a huge number of people that want to help with a huge number of people that need that help? So how do you, being that master organization, guide organizations like ours to say like, okay, in this time of crisis, like we're not operating in America, this is what you should do?
Yeah, it's very important to remember when we talk about the World Food Program, most of our work is in developing countries. And when we go into and we support a country, these are low-income countries, many of them the most fragile countries in the world. This is where the World Food Program works. In fact, a lot of the support that we get is from countries like the United States, from individuals in the United States that really want to support, for example, their home countries. We get a lot of individual donations from people in the US that want to support our programs in El Salvador, that want to support our programs in Honduras, in Venezuela, and Colombia. So there are ways in which the audience and your constituency, your stakeholders can actually also support their own countries and where they come from, which is important to keep in mind. Now, in terms of what we might suggest on the US front, I would say perhaps the most important way to support is boosting that leadership ability, the leadership capacity that Hispanics have in the United States, advocacy and mobilization, so that states and local programs that are crucial safety nets for communities remain at the top of the agenda. That's a very important role that people in the US can play to make sure that those programs are sustained. And then, of course, there are, I'm sure, a lot of grassroots initiatives, as you mentioned, food pantry initiatives, community kitchens initiatives, and different types of grassroots movements that are being born to really support people that are falling through the cracks. It is very important, I think, to continue maintaining the ties with communities to make sure that people are supporting their own grassroots movements in their own communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about what like your area of work. What are the main concerns that we have in the impact of COVID in children? What challenges are you seeing on the ground? Why are school meals so important for so many people? What are you doing about it?
So school meals programs are one of the largest social assistance programs around the world. And here we're talking about in the US, in Europe, and in most of the countries in the developing world. These are programs that are set up in a massive scale to support children from poor families who in many cases come to school not just because of the learning, but also because they're going to get those types of services. They're going to get a meal, they're going to get health services and other kinds of platforms that are also present in schools. So it's a really important strategy that governments use to make sure that we're equalizing access to resources, especially to the children that come from a disadvantaged background to begin with. And when the crisis started, one of the things that we started to see was that with the school closure policies that most of the governments adopted to protect children and their families from the infection of the virus, of course, came the impact on school children of not being able to access that education that they usually should have accessed. So at the height of the crisis, about maybe 2 months ago, we saw that 90% of all the children in the world that were in school were no longer in school. It was about 1.3 billion school children affected. So of the effects of the crisis, school children actually were bearing a huge amount of the brunt of the effects. Now, we quickly, as the World Food Program, we are the leaders internationally on school meals. We are the lead agency that supports developing countries with these programs. And as such, we also hold information about what's happening globally around these programs. We quickly started tracking the effect of the crisis on meals and started to see the numbers going up. Currently, around 370 million children across the world are missing out on their school meals. And this is really critical because it's been in the news a lot in the United States. When families stop getting that guarantee that their children are going to be fed in school, all of a sudden they have to figure out how are they going to compensate for that in the household. And these are families that were already having a problem in terms of putting food on the table. All of a sudden, they lost that benefit that they used to have through the school. Now, what do? So we're looking at families that were very vulnerable to begin with, all across the world, that now have to, on top of everything else, figure out how to support the child through online learning, alternative learning mechanisms, and then a hunger issue starts creeping up as well. So this became quite a big news item at the beginning of the crisis. This issue of the children missing out on school meals has been very high up on government's agenda. All of a sudden, the realization that this enormous safety net that was working through the school infrastructure was no longer there to support families became a very big issue. And so we started mobilizing very quickly, calling on governments to make sure that they were finding alternative solutions to make sure that children continue to be fed. And we know that some of those solutions have been found in the United States, for example. Some of those solutions were found in the UK. Children and their families were getting vouchers to go out and buy food. In some cases in the US, we know that these are prepackaged foods that were starting to get delivered to the houses of children that used to receive the school lunch program. And from the World Food Program's perspective in the countries that we support, we also started to see countries coming up with very creative mechanisms to make sure that children continue to be fed during the crisis. And so we started to see, like in Honduras, teachers getting on their bicycles to deliver food to their students' houses. And as they did that, they started to check up on them, to transmit also COVID awareness materials. Some of the teachers in Africa that were delivering this food to their children into their houses were also delivering textbooks and other kinds of education materials to make sure that children got connected. In Congo, for example, the government issued a learning from home program through TV and newspapers to help children get their lessons from TV at home. And so they also launched a food from home, a feeding from home program, so that parents can really receive the meals that their children should have received in school. Now they're receiving them at home so that they can continue to learn while they have their meal. So we've seen an enormous amount of effort of governments around the world to be able to keep those children fed. And slowly, this problem started to get addressed, although we're still quite concerned, especially in the poorest countries, of the ability of governments to keep this going. And now what we're starting to worry about and what we're starting to think about is what happens when schools reopen, because we're at a point in this crisis where governments are starting to contemplate what happens with the relaxation of the lockdown measures and opening up schools again, and what happens then. And our concern is that the longer schools were closed, the higher the likelihood that children, especially some children, will never return. And these are children, for example, that come from very poor families that might be working now, girls that get married off very, very, very early. In many poor societies, girls get married off because of the burden of the household. And so we started to fear for a whole generation of children that might not come back to school. But we know that there's one element that might bring them back, and that is the promise of meals. And in the Ebola crisis, for example, in Western Africa, we saw that in schools that had meals, children started to come back. The schools that didn't have meals, families kept them at home and kept them doing something else. So now we are in a campaign at the moment, a back to school campaign, to make sure that governments and partners and agencies like UNICEF and the World Food Program, FAO and others are putting in place mechanisms to make sure that when children come back to school, there's a meal program that's there waiting for them. And that's probably the best thing we can do to ensure that all of the children actually come back and complete their education.
And that is amazing, and I think it's also very useful for us in the States to understand the global perspective and try to adhere and follow some of the guidance. For Carmen, I mean, like the situation in America is not that different, I have to say, from, you know, like there's no longer, as you know, that division between developing countries and developed countries, and the developed countries don't have any problems. These are universal, and our Hispanic community is massively affected. Only 16% of people are equipped to be working from home or studying from home, and 1 in 4 are food dependent as well. So 1 in every 4 children are hungry now that they're not going to, you know, don't have access to school. So that's why we are launching this month of action, kicking off on Thursday, to make sure that we have invite companies to donate, particularly food or products, PPEs, but also the volunteers. I mean, like, it's not only the response, you can't actually rely on government to solve the problems, particularly of those people that have, you know, no coverage of government support. And so we're taking action ourselves. And so we have 10 cities that are launching programs, either of distribution of food or programs, or, you know, like, or trying to fundraise to pay their rents of their, you know, their establishment that they cannot pay it anymore. But it's very good to know. I think that for you to know what we're doing, also for us to know how to follow that program of back to school. Carmen, just like a last word, you've been living in Italy at the core, you know, like of the beginning of COVID. Pretty much you saw the worst. You probably are seeing how, you know, like the reestablishment and the relaxation of the you know, like of the lockdown and the measurements. Latin America just started. You know, like in the States, we have 2 or 3 weeks ahead of Latin America. You know, like any words at the personal level, or any closing words as well to all our Hispanic leaders?
Well, I would say from my experience in living in Italy, going through this situation and having to modify even how we work, most of my team, all of my team, had to be grounded at home, and we needed to learn how to do our jobs in a completely different way. Basically stuck in front of a computer from our houses, when we are used to, when crises strike, we are used to rapidly deploying to the countries that need our support. All of a sudden we couldn't do that, and we had to stay and work from Italy in a very severe lockdown. And so I would just say we've gone through 3 months of very challenging circumstances. Really, personally and work-wise, it hasn't been easy. All of us have our specific personal stories. We're all concerned at the same time that we're working for our communities and trying to contribute in the best way possible to what's happening around the world. We also have family members that we're worried about. We have children at home that we're trying to homeschool. We have all kinds of personal challenges now that the world has changed in such a drastic way. But I have to say that that also has become an opportunity. And first of all, teaching us how to work in a more in an environment that doesn't require as much traveling, and for climate change purposes, as you know, that's been a very positive thing. We've learned how to mobilize people from our computers and from our houses instead of going out and flying and meeting with them, which has been also incredibly rewarding to see the response that we've gotten globally, even from the constrained circumstances that we're living. And also a realization that people all around the world are coming together. We have seen a recognition of the work that organizations like the World Food Program do in terms of providing safety nets for the poorest families around the world. And all of a sudden, those of us that live in high-income countries in Europe and the US are starting to realize how powerful, how valuable those programs are, how important government safety nets and government investment are in terms of social programs that really help families stay above water and thrive. And so I think we're going into a new phase, a new era of renewed recognition of that investment into safety nets, into social programs that are so important in communities. And we might be coming out of an era of limited government investment, of downsizing of the government's role in a community and in a country, and probably putting more value into the programs that really keep so much of our communities afloat and that support, in a way, efforts to mitigate inequality around the world. So I'm hopeful. We're coming out in Italy today. Actually, the relaxation of some of the lockdown measures is something we're very happy about. One of the strictest lockdowns in the world is slowly starting to open up. And so in the middle of the springtime, hope is starting to come back, but also inspiration from the enormous amount of support and the positive reactions we've been having from across the world of the work that we do also inspires us and should inspire your network as well, in the knowledge that the work that we do in our communities is now more valuable than ever.
Yeah, that is an incredible couple, and you know, like, me da ilusión, me da esperanza note. Muchas gracias, Carmen Burbano de Lara from the World Food Program, for being with us today and for educating us about, like, the food crisis and what the programs you're doing. We will support the Back to School program, and we'll make sure that we link some of the resources you mentioned. Ideally, we can find them as best practices for our community. Thank you so much, Carmen, for being with us.
Muchas gracias, con mucho gusto.
Sí, claro. Hasta luego. Gracias a todos. Hasta mañana.
Luego.
Bye.
Chao, chao.